squared equals 5. So let's just remind you of what it is without the quadratic under. So let's just say if we had x plus 1 equals 3. A lot of you got this wrong on your test. And here's what you got wrong. If you go back to my lecture on this, I said lots of you will get this wrong. And then you still did. What do we do first? We're looking at this one. Square both sides. You don't just drop the root and then solve it, okay? You square both sides, which means the square root and the squared cancel, and you have what on the other side? 9. That's where you messed up. You still had a 3, for example. And then we solve. Now, what was the special thing about radicals? You always have to check, and we're checking that if you plug it in, that it doesn't give you a negative under the square root. 0 is okay, but not a negative. So plugging in 8, does that give us a negative under the root? No, so it's okay. So this would be your solution. Okay, now we start this the same. Do it the same way. Square both sides. X squared plus 9 equals 25. Make sure you square the other side. Then how do we solve a quadratic? We don't isolate the x and move everything to the other side. We move it all to the side of the x squared and factor or use a quadratic equation. So we're going to subtract the 25. 9 minus 25? Minus 16. And now what? Factor, what type is this called? Difference of squares. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. So x plus 4 equals 0, or x minus 4 equals 0. All right, so when we check, do they both work, one work, or none work? So when you check, this is somewhere else, another place that people went wrong, and I did mention this last class, is make sure when you're checking that you actually write down the exact equation with the roots and everything that you had in the beginning, not after you squared it, but before you started anything. However I have it typed, that's what you're checking in. So when you plug in x is negative 4, what happens here? What's negative 4 squared? Positive 16. Is that equal to 5? Yep. And what about the other one? Same thing. 4 squared, this time a positive 4 squared. Still positive 16. Right, still works. So both of them work. So what would we then do at this point to make sure I mark it? What goes in between? Or a comma. Circle your answer so we can find it. Okay? So of course they get much more complicated. Ready? Jump into, we'll jump into much more complicated and then much more complicated. Okay. Now we've not seen anything like this yet. We did see questions that had 2 radicals, but not a number as well. Okay, so this has how many terms? 3. It's got a radical term that holds it together as one term, the root, a 1, and this other one. Okay, so the method is this. If you have 2 radicals, and we won't see more because then it won't be quadratic anymore. So this would be the most radicals you'd see in a question. You isolate. What does isolate mean? Get it by itself. You isolate whatever you think is the most complicated radical. Okay? And don't be all cocky and pick the easier one to isolate, because then it makes your work a lot harder. So which one do you think is the more complicated one? Right, this one. In this, and if they were both similar, then it really wouldn't matter. Okay? But, so write a step out in your notes, what we just did. So what was step 1? Isolate the most complicated radical. So you should write that down beside it. So when you look back, you know that that's what we did first. It might already be isolated, and then you wouldn't have to do it. Now we square both sides. So what does it look like to square both sides? I'm going to write it as a new line, but you can just put a squared up here. So 3x minus 2 squared. And this side, what would that look like? A bracket all squared. You have to square the whole side. Not individually. That's totally wrong. That's going back to that same thing where you don't split up the square root into 2 parts. You have to do it as a whole. So what you're doing is you square both sides. So write that as a step 2. Step 1, isolate the most complicated radical. Step 2 would be square both sides. Remember to put both sides in a big bracket. You might write that down. Okay, so that you're not just, it's not square all 3 terms, which is not allowed. All right, now the left-hand side, what happens? Right, takes out of the square root and the square cancel, so 3x minus 2. That side's easy. What about the right-hand side? How do you square a bracket? Yeah, FOIL. You don't square individual terms. That's not right. You have to write it out. And do FOIL. Okay? So, what are we going to have? I'm just rewriting the 3x minus 2. So, root of 4x times root of 4x. 4x. What about this one? Negative, because there's one negative sign. Negative 1 times root 4x. And the middle, same thing. And last, negative 1 times negative 1? Plus 1. All right, and then simplify it, which is to put like terms together. So we have 3x minus 2 equals 4x. How do these two join together? Yeah, just think of it like if you were looking at minus x, how would you write that together? Minus 2x, or x plus x is 2x. So here we have minus, what if we had minus root x minus root x? That would be minus 2 root x. Oh, sorry. Right, if there's two of the same thing, they're both minus, so minus, what would this be? Minus 2 root 4x. Okay? And plus 1. All right. So remember, this was much more complicated. Here it is. We've squared both sides, but we still can't just put the x's to one side because one of them is still in a radical. So what's your guess for our next step? Isolate the next radical. So get it by itself, everything else on the other side, so you can do FOIL with it. So, let's move this to the left so that it's positive. So we're going to isolate the next radical. All right, let's bring it over here. We've got a 4x plus 1 on the right. We're going to bring the 3x over, becomes a negative. A minus 2 over becomes a positive. Now we have to go to the new page. 2 root 4x equals, how many x's? Just one. 4x minus 3x. And numbers? Plus 3. Now we've isolated the radical. Square both sides. And yes, you can divide by 2 to get just the radical on this side, but it makes fractions, so I wouldn't bother. So we're going to, and just like the last time we squared both sides, make sure you put both sides in a bracket. And basically this is the we're going to do the same thing, we'll square this, but this is a process no matter how many radicals are in a question. You isolate one of them, square both sides. Work it all out, simplify, start over again. Isolate the radicals, square both sides, work it all out, and you would keep doing that until there was no more radicals. Now if you go on in math, you'll see more than just 2. In this class, we're just seeing 2, and that's the most you would see in calculus as well. How do we square this? Remember to square everything, and they're multiplied, so we can square both. It's not 2 plus, right? It's 2 times, so we do 2 squared and root 4x squared. On this side, we need to do FOIL. 2 squared is 4, root 4x squared is 4x. X squared, x times 3 is 3x, plus 3x, and 3 and 3, 9. 4 times 4 is 16, 3 and 3 is 6. All right, no more radicals, so that's good. And we can just solve. So how do we solve a quadratic? Move everything to one side so that it's equal 0. Minus 10x plus 9. All right. After all that, you hope it factors. And does it? Yay. It does. Minus 9 and minus 1. So here's our 2 numbers, but because it was a radical equation, we need to check. I don't have much room to check here, but we write our original equation down. Before you squared anything, before you changed it, and you would plug these in. So if we plug in the 9, 3 times 9, 27 minus 2, is that positive? Yep. The other side, 4 times 9, positive? Yeah, and you could go through and check. This is 25 plus 1. Root 25 is 5 plus 1. This is root 36. 5 plus 1 equals 6. And what about the other one? 1, will 1 work? 3 times 1 is 3 minus 2. Root 1 is 1. And the other side, 4 times 1. So they're both answers. Stick an or between them or a comma and give it a circle. All right, that was the much harder one. Did you find that hard? I know you followed, but you remember you have to watch your steps when you try it yourself, right? Okay, so the much, much harder one. It looks innocent enough. In fact, it looks nicer than the last one, but what's going to happen to make it much harder? Can you take a guess where it could go harder? It doesn't factor in the end. Okay, so this one won't factor, we'll have to use quadratic equation. But other than that, so that would be worst case scenario. So first step is isolate the hardest radical, which is already isolated, so we square both sides. Remember to put a bracket over both sides. This one will be 2x plus 1, and the other one we need to use FOIL to expand it. So just rewrite the 2x plus 1. Root x times root x is x. Root x times 1 is 1 root x, plus another root x, and 1 and 1 is 1. 1 times 1. Okay, so these combine to be 2 root x. We're going to isolate the 2 root x, that term, move everything else to the other side. Oh, this actually looks nice. Maybe it's not much harder. This looks very nice, in fact. Why am I changing my idea? What happens here? The ones cancel? So what are we left with on this side? Just x. That's nice. Oh, that is much nicer. All right, what now? Square both sides? I'm pausing because I'm wondering if I messed up. If I'm messing up now, or if I messed up earlier when I tried it in my office. I'm thinking that no one's correcting me, so we're still okay? All right, we'll square both sides. Remember, you guys are the good ones at correcting me, right? Not that silly morning class that let me make mistakes and go on for a page before they tell me. Root x, so square both, the 2 and the root x. Okay. Oh yeah, this is kind of weird. It does factor though. I meant for it not to factor, but it's okay, factors. Be careful you don't do something silly. So tell me something that you could do that's wrong. Or maybe you think it's right. Yeah, so dividing both sides by x would be wrong. Okay, we don't do that ever when you're solving. Yeah, same as any quadratic. You always move it to one side, it equals 0, and then factor. Okay, so x squared minus 4x equals 0, and then factor. Because this is 2 factors, so x equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0, there's 2 possible answers. And if you had divided both sides by x, what would have happened? You would just have x equals 4, and you would have missed one of the answers that works. Okay, do you see that? Okay, so we don't divide when we are solving for x. We don't ever divide. We can divide by a number on both sides, but not a variable or a variable expression. So check, always back to the original. Plugging 0 in. 0 times 2 is 0. Root 0. Is root 0 okay? Yeah, it's 0. Root 1 is okay. It's 1. So that one works. We didn't get a negative under the root. And the second one, the 4. 2 times 4 is 8 plus 1. That works. It's root 9, which is 3. And this side is 2 plus 1, which is 3. They both work. Stick an or between them. Give them a circle. Hopefully you have more room than I do.